Yeah, the accent probably gives it away, but I'm not from Florida originally. I'm from LA, Lower Alabama. So, no, that LA. So we'll talk about how, why, what attracted me to these topics sort of as we go, maybe toward the end with the Q&A session, right? This isn't about me. This is about the civil rights movement as it existed in Florida. When we think about Florida as being someone who's only lived here 16 years, some of you maybe more recently than that, when we think of Florida, we don't tend to think of it as a culturally deep South state, particularly when it comes to the master narrative of the civil rights movement, right? So I'm going to use that phrase, master narrative. And the master narrative is often that 1954, maybe 1955, but 1954 to 1968 chronology. Brown versus Board of Education to the assassination of Dr. King. Maybe Montgomery bus boycott, maybe murder of Emmett Till, but that's usually the master narrative. That's what we think. And Florida usually in the master narrative doesn't play a central role in that struggle. But what I want to do with this lecture is to argue that Florida should not be seen at the periphery of the movement, but that Florida should actually be at the center of the way that we understand the civil rights movement at the state, national, and local levels. Because we're going to see through looking at Florida how those three levels work together to develop civil rights legislation and to bring greater equality and represent resistance to that equality in the nation as a whole. The patterns that we see replicate themselves at the national level, we first see in Florida. One of my favorite documentarians often says that the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And in the realm of civil rights, that is particularly true. So, state, local, and national campaigns, the civil rights movement in Florida. When we think of Florida nationally, we don't think of, as I said, a deep South state. We think of sunshine and we think of NASA. We think about the Mouse, the Daytona 500, Miami, which is much different than any other place in Florida. We tend to think of recreation and maybe NASA. We think of big cities like Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando. But Florida has always had a place in the national imagination as the Italy of America or the tropical paradise of America. And we see that from the very beginning of Spanish settlement. From Spanish settlement all the way to British colonization, back to Spain, to the United States, we have authors who are writing about Florida from almost a romanticized perspective, right? And as you get into the 19th century, Stephen Crane, Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Bartram, moving into the 20th century, industrialists like Henry Flagler, Walt Disney, are thinking about Florida in terms of an escape from the rest of the nation. That postcard, the Sunshine State, sort of personifies what Florida is in the popular mind. It's part of America, but not really part of America. It's different. However, as in all things race relations in Florida, if you look just below the surface, you see that Florida resembles not just the rest of the Deep South, but America as a whole, even in tourism. African Americans have occupied a place that reflects their status in greater society. Now, this idea that Florida is different is often called the myth of Florida exceptionalism, right? That Florida somehow economically, culturally, socially, it's a world apart. Not part of the Deep South, but you see patterns, you see themes, you see a dehumanization and a second-class citizenship of African Americans that characterize the rest of the nation. even in terms of tourism, our number one industry. From the beginning of the tourist trade in Florida, African Americans have been portrayed as an oddity, as a group either to be ridiculed or seen as less than, undeserving of equal citizenship. Look, guys, this is white supremacy. The idea that any other race besides the white race can achieve a level of sophistication, intelligence, evolution, development that black people can't reach. You see it in the postcards, right? Postcards are primary sources. The way that historians talk about the past is through source analysis. We don't make this stuff up, for the most part. We look at the primary sources, and one of the things that Northerners who came to Florida would purchase to send back to their relatives before they had Instagram, before they had Twitter, before they had cell phones, you bought postcards, okay? And those postcards reflected a mindset. In St. Augustine, for example, the one to the left, we have featured the old slave market with an elderly African American who conjures images of a world that has now passed us by, enslavement, standing in front of the market, bent over a cane, reminding people of the way things, quote unquote, used to be. This is playing on a particular kind of nostalgia, okay? I often have people tell me, oh, I'm so glad you teach history. I love history. And what they reveal is that they don't love history, they love nostalgia. Because history is difficult, history is complex, history is uncomfortable. Nostalgia is a manufactured past that never existed, that's created to make us feel better about our political beliefs in the contemporary, the way things used to be, the good old days. Those were the days, Archie Bunker, right? A nostalgia, not historical truth. These postcards reveal that African Americans are seen as less than, fit only for, some of these postcards are literally labeled alligator bait. Okay? There is a unique, if you wanted to look these up, there are dozens of them on the internet. They are called, well, they're called derogatively coon cards. And that's how they were sold, and that's how they were sent back. But if you look up Florida racist postcards, you're going to see a litany. And it spans the gamut, right, in terms of ridicule, laughter, but it's a dehumanization. It's a dehumanization. And you see it with the quote-unquote darkie's prayer in black dialect, not formal English, being chased by an alligator. Even our alligator farms would find it humorous to sell fans with images like these put on them. This is common. This is the alligator bait, one of the forms that I talked about. So, you know, just from a few primary sources, and I haven't gotten into the most gruesome, okay? Because the most gruesome of these postcards depicted lynchings. It is white supremacy with a Florida flavor, but it's still an assertion of white supremacy. So what that tells us is that far be it from outside the national mainstream, when it comes to race relations, Florida is at the center. There are other reasons that Florida should be at the center of our civil rights struggle. So I thought that showing you some of the primary sources from the beginning tied to tourism would be a way to sort of open that door to exploring this topic. But, as I said, there are 4 major reasons that I want to leave you with. 4 reasons that I believe that Florida should be at the center of the nation's civil rights history. First and foremost, you can't talk about race relations in Florida without starting with episodes of racial violence that characterize this state, okay? Now, one of the issues with teaching history, now I say this every class, almost every class, that I teach. The question we have to ask is, where do we start and where do we end? It's the same thing here when talking about episodes of racial violence in Florida. We tend to think of Mississippi and Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama, as the places where racial violence peaked, where it was at its worst during the 20th century, during the civil rights era. But this is happening in Florida long before those episodes in the Deep South states made national headlines, okay? So the place that I want to start is with the practice of lynching. Between 1880 and 1930, the high watermark of lynching in America. And lynching is when an individual is held responsible for an alleged crime and punished by a group of people outside of the legal justice system, often without fear of punishment. That's what a lynching is, okay? Between 1880 and 1930, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. It was more dangerous for an African American to live in Florida between 1880 and 1930 than to live in Alabama. The lynching rate in Alabama was, in Florida, it was 3 times higher than Alabama. It was twice as high than it was in Mississippi. Okay? And there are a lot of reasons for that, but the lynching is just, again, another gateway into understanding how racial violence has characterized this state during a time where it might not have made international news. It may not have even made national news. Let's start with Ocoee. The Ocoee Massacre of 1920. 1920 was a huge year. And one of the things that this topic demonstrates, by the way, that I want to point out before we even get started, is that it demonstrates that African Americans have always resisted their dehumanization and their second-class citizenship. Always. During the period of enslavement, during Reconstruction, as the 20th century began, in a variety of ways. Now, maybe not rebellion, maybe not openly, but one of the things that was always a foundation for black resistance and an assertion of their humanity was becoming educated. Education was always a way that African Americans resisted their dehumanization, because during enslavement and even thereafter, it was illegal. As a matter of fact, in 1885, just sort of off the top of my head, in 1885, the first Florida Constitution written after Reconstruction, Florida was the first state to make it illegal for black and white children to attend schools together. Okay? Now, most education was already segregated because no quote-unquote self-respecting white person would send their child to a school with black kids. But Florida put it into law for the first time in 1885. One of the reasons that education is always the mark of resistance is because education was a way that African Americans mobilized the vote. And in 1919, women, for the first time, have the right to vote. In Florida, there is a statewide movement. The historian Paul Ortiz says that it's the first statewide struggle to organize black people in the United States targeting the 1920 election. This was a time where African Americans were encouraging each other, forming organizations to cast ballots in that presidential election as Republicans. What it sparked was the single worst episode of election day violence this nation has ever seen, not too far from here in Ocoee. An African-American man tries to exercise his right to vote, is met with armed resistance. There are no federal laws protecting voters like there are now. He retreats to a house of a man named July Perry. An organized effort to bring Klansmen and other organized white supremacists into the area from Orlando and from Lake County and from surrounding areas, launched a one-week massacre that targeted the entire black community. It was meant to send a message. Okay? And the Ocoee Massacre, as it became known, when the NAACP did an investigation after it occurred, They noted that the entire black community, which was prosperous, by the way, there were landowning African Americans in Ocoee. That was part of the problem to the white establishment. Economic self-sufficiency was, in some ways, it could be a kiss of death, okay, for reasons that we'll talk about as we go. But the NAACP did their investigation afterwards, and they noticed that the entire black community had been forced out of Ocoee after a week of violence. Homes are burnt, women and children are shot, never to come back and claim that property, okay? The NAACP said that there were 56 documented deaths, but there were dozens more who disappeared and were never accounted for. So what happened on Election Day in Ocoee and the week afterward remains to this day the single worst day of political violence on Election Day in American history. So we've got then politics and the vote as being a point of contention, and we can apply that to other southern locations. We see that occur in Florida. In 1923, Rosewood, an episode that, this is probably the episode that most non-Floridians have heard of, right? Rosewood is a case study for a lot of episodes of racial violence that occurred elsewhere throughout the South. And it's kind of the same pattern that you see in Ocoee. It's not politically related, but it is related to the fact that because of the abundance of land, African Americans were able to have some sort of economic self-sufficiency because they did not depend on whites for their income. That's going to draw a lot of jealousy, a lot of animosity, a lot of anger from poor whites who don't own their own land. The episode that occurred in Rosewood, which has been debunked by eyewitnesses who were not interviewed at the time, was that a white woman claimed to have been sexually assaulted by a black man. Now that's the surefire way during this period to ignite racial unrest in a community for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to go into. But this is what started the clearance at Rosewood. Like Ocoee, it situates around one person who's accused, but the entire community is targeted. After a week of shooting and burning, property destruction and destruction of lives, the entire black community in Rosewood left. We didn't know about Rosewood until the 1980s. It was 1983 that the story of what happened in Rosewood first went national, okay? The state of Florida did an investigation that lasted into the 1990s, and they did something that rarely happens in government. They apologized, and they gave the 9 surviving members reparations. So, the example of what is called a clearance, in which not an individual but an entire community is targeted, this usually happened outside of the South. This happened in places like East St. Louis. This happened in places like Tulsa, Black Wall Street. This happened in places like Chicago in 1919, right? In the South, it was more individualized, but Florida demonstrates that there are national patterns at work here as well. 1934, the lynching of Claude Neal, the last quote-unquote spectacle lynching of the 20th century. At least that's what it was called at the time. Evidence has surfaced that that is actually untrue. But a spectacle lynching is one that is announced in advance. It is ritualized, it is torture, crowds come, and it is an event. The NAACP made the lynching of Claude Neal their first case in which they tried to have a federal anti-lynching law passed in Congress. It failed. But, again, what happens in Florida attracts national attention, and for the first time, the NAACP really begins to pay attention to what's going on in the state of Florida. Now, the NAACP is a very legalistic organization, okay? The NAACP believed in reform through the legal process, through the courts. And one of the things that they wanted, before they focused on integrated schools, get to that in a minute, was a federal anti-lynching law, because states aren't enforcing it. If you look at the death certificates, and Claude Neal is no exception, the cause of death died at hands of persons unknown. The state wouldn't investigate. What the NAACP wanted was to use instances like Claude Neal, the photographs that were taken, by the way, and sold as postcards. Marianna, Florida, like many other southern cities, southern towns, sold souvenirs that could be mailed to let outsiders know that the racial order is preserved in this city, right? The NAACP wanted to make this a federal crime. It failed. But it was a national campaign using Florida as the example. Groveland. We're in Lake County. Willis McCall. You want to talk about an individual that demonstrates how the Lord High Sheriff is judge, jury, executioner, almost out of central casting when it comes to white racist power brokers who operated on the behalf of citrus barons to make sure that cheap black labor is provided. That's Willis McCall. The Groveland Four, again, dubious circumstances. We still don't know what happened. We know that a sexual assault didn't. But a 17-year-old white female accused 4 African Americans of sexual assault. 2 of them were not even in the city, right? But they're targeted. 1 is hunted down, shot 400 times by a posse. 400 times. A posse that Willis McCall led. 2 others, well, the other 3 are given the death penalty. 1 is not because he was a minor. He was 16 years old. Because of this injustice, because of the coverage that it received by some courageous people that I'll talk about in a minute, the NAACP by this time had shifted tactics, and they had decided that they wanted to use the legal system to go after the death penalty because of the way that it was being inadequately applied to black people, black men in particular. Who comes to Groveland? Who comes to Lake County? Mr. Civil Rights himself, Thurgood Marshall. Okay? The event that really gains international attention was that the United States Supreme Court, for a variety of reasons, demanded that the 2 living adult of the Groveland Four receive a new trial. Willis McCall said, we will take them from Rayford back to Groveland in my personal car. He had a flat tire, shot the 2 Groveland boys that were in his back, who were chained together by the wrists and the ankles, and said they attacked him. One of those men survived, even though he was shot 4 times. And he basically testified that they were executed. Okay? A grand jury claimed it was self-defense, of course. Okay? So again, you want to understand the legal system, the role that law enforcement plays, the roles that the court play, the role that national organizations play. One of the things that Thurgood Marshall later said, and you see the infamous photograph of Willis McCall standing outside of his car after the execution attempt, and you see the Groveland 3 with McCall posing in front of them. But later, one of the things that Thurgood Marshall always said was that because of the case of the Groveland 4, the NAACP started a fundraising campaign to fight these injustices in the court. And it was Thurgood Marshall himself who said Brown versus Board was funded by the attention that Groveland attracted throughout the United States and the world. So again, local, state, national change. Harry T. Moore. Harry T. Moore, I'm going to show you another picture of him soon, but in 1951, on Christmas night, Harry T. Moore, who was the executive director of the NAACP in Florida, he was the first state-level, full-time, paid employee of the NAACP, and because of his voter registration efforts, and because of the fact that he was the one who got the oral testimonies of the Groveland boys' families, he was marked for death. And on Christmas night of 1951, dynamite was placed under his bedroom floor, and he and his wife, Harriet, were both killed. The blast was heard. This is in Mims. I actually did the reading for this yesterday for my class. The blast was heard for 4 miles away. Right? Harry T. Moore was the first NAACP official assassinated for his efforts at human equality. And let's not lose sight of that. This is human equality. This is American citizenship. The first NAACP official assassinated for those activities in the United States. When we think about the execution of NAACP officials, for people who know this history, for people who know the civil rights history, it's often Medgar Evers. 1963, Mississippi. No. The book about Harry T. Moore that tells his story is literally titled Before His Time. And if it had occurred after 1954, maybe Harry T. Moore would be recorded in history books as the first martyr for justice that this nation produced. Axe Handle Saturday, Jacksonville. Another interesting thumbnail that we can use to say, okay, what is going on at the national level? What's going on in the national level in 1960, particularly after February 1st? So the sit-ins in Greensboro literally started a nonviolent revolution inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott, and the philosophy behind that, Dr. King and the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Well, in Jacksonville, as occurred in many cities throughout the South, young African Americans are inspired by the idea that you could start a nonviolent revolution by just ignoring an unjust law. Entering into a department store where you could buy food, but you couldn't eat it in the dining area. You had to take it to a segregated park. Where you could buy clothes, but you couldn't try those clothes on. You had to take them home, and if it doesn't fit, sorry, right? So this idea that our money is taken, but we're treated as second-class citizens inside of those facilities is what sparked the sit-in campaign. We always think of, and they lived happily ever after, the sit-ins and nonviolence worked. Not everywhere. What we see in Jacksonville is that rumors of an attempted sit-in had spread. And the police were who helped publicize the fact that this event was going to occur. So, many white men decided that they would meet nonviolence with violence just to see how committed the activists were. They used axe handles to brutalize the people that entered those facilities. And you have photographs that survived, like this one. The interesting thing, too, about Axe Handle Saturday is that it demonstrates that newspapers aren't always the best source of information. The only reason we know about Axe Handle Saturday is because of a small number of photographs and oral histories. The newspapers, and this is not uncommon, I've discovered, particularly in Florida. Jacksonville is called the bold city of the New South, right? During this time, Jacksonville's doing everything that they can to get outside investments in industry to come into the city. So what they didn't want to portray, what they didn't want to proclaim, what they didn't want to cover was that there were episodes of violence or civil rights activity that were occurring in the city. So it was ignored in the local papers. If you go to the Times-Union, they don't mention what happened downtown that July Saturday. So again, what happens in Florida, what happens at the local level, opens up a discussion about what's going on nationally, and it gives us another angle that, as one activist said, that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. The Invisible Empire, the Ku Klux Klan. I do a separate lecture just on the Florida Klan, right? And one of the things that I stress is that there is no one Klan, okay? The Klan has ebbed and flowed in American history over time at different periods for different reasons. But when looking at the existence of the Klan in Florida, there are two certainties that we can conclude. One, the largest Klan units over time have existed in this state. And number two, the strongest in terms of how it infiltrated city government, how it infiltrated law enforcement, how it infiltrated the justice system was stronger in Florida than in any other state for a longer period of time. Okay? This is in Callahan, Florida. This is in North Florida in Nassau County. And it is a public cross burning and swearing in. 1956 is an important year because it's 2 years after Brown. After Brown v. Board of Education is unanimously decided by the Supreme Court, there is a backlash. Anytime there is progress, anytime we see a movement toward a more equal society in terms of race, class, gender, there's going to be a backlash. Okay? There's going to be a backlash. From pre-Reconstruction all the way through today. For every step forward we take in terms of racial equality and justice, there will be resistance. We see that the Klan in Florida peaks at 1956 through 1960. We think about the Klan in Mississippi as being the strongest. The Mississippi Klan doesn't really begin to peak until 1962 and 63 when you've got Freedom Summer beginning to be planned. Right? So, the thing about this photograph that I find so disturbing as well, look at the number of children that are there. There are auxiliary units for young people in these Klan organizations, whether it's Miami, whether it's Callahan, whether it's Pensacola. There are also female auxiliary units. So it's not just dumb white rednecks, the stereotypical Klan. No. In some places, this is a family affair. Why? Because racial supremacy was seen as a family value worth preserving, even with violence if necessary, and they do use violence, often. St. Augustine, 1964, where I'm from. We often forget that Dr. King was in St. Augustine when the Civil Rights Act was signed. No, I'm sorry, when it was passed. He was actually in D.C. with LBJ when it was signed. Right? This is the only campaign in Florida that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference sponsored. In other words, the SCLC is Dr. King. And in St. Augustine, for a variety of reasons, the local movement had come to a standstill. This is the aftermath of Birmingham. This is the aftermath of the March on Washington. This is as the Civil Rights Act is working its way through Congress. Local people in St. Augustine asked Dr. King and his organization to come in. The St. Augustine campaign is fascinating. It is transpiring as the Civil Rights Act is working its way through Congress, and Dr. King did not want to be in St. Augustine. The fear was it was too violent. Marches were happening at night. If you've been to St. Augustine before, it's still dark now at night. During that period, lighting at night was almost non-existent. Not only that, but different white supremacist groups had come to St. Augustine to, as they said, relieve the besieged good people of St. Augustine. They called Dr. King a monster that was sent to destroy the city. Right? This is where they were going to stop the Civil Rights Act. So it was, as Dr. King called it, the magnificent drama that was playing out. The one fact that I'll leave you about the St. Augustine campaign that always blows my mind. And I heard this from Andrew Young himself. St. Augustine was the only SCLC campaign in which medical expenses were higher than legal costs. Not Selma, not Birmingham. St. Augustine. Medical costs exceeded legal fees. Picture of Dr. King walking. It's the only photograph that exists of Dr. King physically on a street that is later named after him. right? That's in St. Augustine. It's the only city in Florida where Dr. King is ever arrested. Somehow the Chamber of Commerce doesn't advertise that in their tourist pamphlets, I don't know why. But one of the photographs, I actually had a friend she brought her husband to a lecture that I gave about the St. Augustine movement. He's from Italy. And he said that photograph to the right, to your right, was in their history textbooks when talking about Jim Crow and the civil rights movement in America. This was taken on the day before the vote was held in Congress, in the Senate, to ratify the Civil Rights Act. There were still questions about whether or not the Civil Rights Act would pass. And it was a wait-in at a local pool. The Monson Motor Lodge was the name of the establishment. Regardless, the owner, when this happened, when a white guest invited his black friends into the pool with him because he was a registered guest of the hotel, the owner lost his mind. His name was James Brock. James Brock picked up 2 gallons of muriatic acid and began pouring them in the pool. Okay? And when he began to do that, AP photographers took the picture. That picture was on the cover of Washington newspapers the next day when the Senate voted to pass the Civil Rights Act. So there were senators, I've heard George McGovern say, yeah, we were talking about that picture the next day, and it was, this is why we have to make sure this passes. And of course, the Civil Rights Act, the most far-reaching piece of federal civil rights legislation this nation has ever produced, protects the civil rights of everybody in this room, okay? This is why there have been so many efforts to try to scale it back, by the way. Same thing with the Voting Rights Act. That's not a political statement, that's a factual statement, okay? Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, 64, 65, the 2 major pieces of federal legislation that secured the constitutional rights for all people to vote and be accepted as equal citizens in this nation, okay? But that doesn't mean that the movement ends. No, 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 no. It means that it shifts. I think Florida is one of the best states to examine to prove the point that just because the fight against de jure segregation ends, doesn't mean that the movement ends. Now, de jure segregation is segregation by law. If a law is unjust, you can pass a law that counters that injustice. Segregation, Jim Crow, separate libraries, parks, restrooms, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can pass the Civil Rights Act to say that this is unconstitutional. Cool. Poll taxes, literacy tests, elements that are put into place to keep the black vote low. Okay, in 65, after Selma and Bloody Sunday, and by the way, a fight that Harry T. Moore was fighting 30 years earlier, we can remove those obstacles and ensure that elections are now patrolled by the federal government and that people have the right to exercise their constitutionally protected ballot. Cool. De jure segregation then, over. But de facto segregation remains. The movement doesn't end. It evolves. And Dr. King was really, really conscious about this difference as he wrote in his last years of life. Florida is a great example to look at this. Why? Because you can look at places like Miami to show that there are instances of injustice that come from year after year after year of de jure segregation that have de facto consequences. Housing, educational discrepancies, employment, urbanization, urban planning, redlining. All of this leads to a major civil rights demonstration in 1968 in Miami to highlight these continued injustices and to demand a Fair Housing Act that occurred in conjunction with the Republican National Convention that was held in Miami, and the National Guard was sent in to disperse. What's going on here? The Republican National Convention, in which Richard Nixon was endorsed, by the way. The National Guard being used to stop protests because it makes the city, quote unquote, look bad. Keeping delegates out of Overton the struggle continues. My research demonstrates that in Pensacola, the Panhandle, a different world, by the way, that the process of desegregation was relatively painless. I say relatively because there were still growth pains, but in the 1970s, all hell broke loose. Violence. The Klan tries a national resurgence in Pensacola. National Guard is called. Federal agencies are contacted. Why? 2 reasons. A litany of shootings of black motorists under questionable circumstances by white law enforcement, and the presence of Confederate imagery in public schools. And those images were used to let African American students know who were bussed in that they didn't belong there, that they were unwanted. As a matter of fact, when we talk about images and symbols and nicknames and things of that nature, out of this case in Pensacola in the mid-1970s, a federal judge ruled that because the presence of these symbols were quote-unquote racial irritants, it undermined the purpose of Brown v. Board. So now we're getting into practices. Now we're getting into policies. Now we're getting into cultures that recognized racial differences. And that's part of the movement that continues. Arthur McDuffie in Miami and other law enforcement related acts of brutality. I mean, the Arthur McDuffie case is brutal, if you ever read about that. And again, this Arthur McDuffie is the Rodney King episode before Rodney King. Okay? White officers kill him, frame it as an accident. There's no videotape, but an all-white jury declares that the 4 officers are not guilty, and it started riots. Of course, Trayvon Martin in 2012. Another national figure to understand that, yeah, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. The urban-rural divide is the second reason. Now, I spend most of the time going through the violence because it is so instructive, okay? That is really where you can see at the state level, at the local level, having national importance and also reflecting national trends, right? You can do no worse than looking at the state of Florida to understand the movement at a big level. But for me, another one of the reasons that Florida should be studied is because of the centrality of local economics in how the movement progresses. And what I mean by that is that in some areas throughout the Deep South, it is easily explained that the movement progresses the way that it does because of the prevalence of rural agriculture, rural economies, and in some places in bigger cities like Atlanta and Atlanta and Charlotte, Dallas, Birmingham, that it's more urban centered. Well, in Florida, because of the size and the diversity, what we see is that you can study various parts of Florida at various times to understand the role that economics plays in the way that the struggle progresses as it does, okay? So tourism on the right activities are scheduled, activities are planned to disrupt tourist economies by specific organizations. Why do they do that? When do they do that? You can understand the role and the objective of movement activities to do as I do, to try to teach students that there's always an objective to these demonstrations. It's not haphazard. There is a philosophy behind it. You can also understand the role that something like convict lease is going to play in the way that the movement progresses, right? Florida is the first state to really perfect the convict lease system. Now, the convict lease system pertained to the railroad, the turpentine industries, even the citrus industry to a degree. In the aftermath of the Civil War, cheap labor is gone. Slavery is abolished. So now landowners had to have cheap labor in order to maximize profits. How do they do this? Well, one of the things that you see, and this carries over into the 20th century in some southern states, is that crimes are labeled, quote unquote, black crimes, and the punishments are accelerated. Vagrancy is a great example of this. Vagrancy means that you cannot demonstrate evidence that you are employed. So you had to have a job, and you had to have paperwork from someone that you worked for saying you were employed. If you were asked at any time by a law enforcement agent to produce your papers and you didn't have them, you could be arrested for vagrancy. And the penalty for vagrancy was $500 fine, 5 years at hard labor. Okay? Now you're arrested. What does that mean? It means now that the state, to pay your fine or to make money for the state, they can lease you for pennies a day to a landowner. Convict labor for economic purposes is literally leased to these major landowners, these major business owners, so that they could have cheap labor, and it created a situation that, as one author said, was, quote, worse than slavery. Okay? The only state that had convict lease on the books longer was Alabama. So it is a system of constant peonage that was meant to control, it was meant to enrich the already wealthy. It was racially based. So, but one of the things about Florida, too, is that the movement responds to local need. And that's one of the things that in my class we've seen over and over and over again. Because Florida is so big and Florida is so diverse, with fishing and citrus and tourism from St. Augustine to Groveland to Pensacola, right? That the local needs are different. So, looking at the different locations throughout Florida demonstrates how local need conditioned the movement in that area. One of the things that it demonstrates, I think more importantly, is that the civil rights movement is not a monolithic movement. All people aren't fighting for the same things and using the same organizations all the time. It just doesn't happen that way. Florida's a great place then to look at the complexities of the movement and not think of it as just a top-down organization or individual-led campaign. The third reason that Florida is important, it's the least sensationalistic, but I also think it's one of the most insidious. And that is the political approach, okay? Particularly as we get into the 20th century. And this is where the difference in image between the Deep South and Florida becomes clear. Florida deliberately takes the political approach to not embrace massive resistance as a tactic. Now, massive resistance is what George Wallace and Ross Barnett, Lester Maddox later in Georgia, these Deep South governors used to say, we are going to use everything we possibly can, legally and otherwise, if we have to ensure that civil rights doesn't take hold. Well, Dr. King recognized this, SCLC recognized this, and they basically said, okay, we can create tension, he called it creative tension, in which there is a public outcry, and that will force the federal government to get involved and force racial change, right? Florida deliberately took the other path. They basically said, we are not going to embrace massive resistance. As a matter of fact, we are going to claim we will obey the law as the law plays out through the court systems. And they did everything they can from the executive level through the local to slow the pace of integration to a crawl. This is the tactic that's known as stonewalling. This is the tactic that's known as tokenism. This was the tactic that worked to get to the point where in 1966, 90% of students in Florida public schools attended a segregated institution. There were still school systems in Florida that were under a federal integration mandate in 2016. What did that look like? I'll give you a great example. I mean, look, when Brown was enacted in 1954, Roy Wilkins called it the Second Emancipation Proclamation. But there was one huge obstacle there. It didn't have a time frame. The person who wrote the playbook to delay implementation was the Florida Attorney General, a man named Richard Irvin. And Richard Irvin basically gave the blueprint that southern states could use that said implementation had to take as long as possible. Part of the rationale was we've had 300 years of enslavement and 300 years of segregation. It's going to take at least 300 years to integrate the schools. Seriously, right? This idea led to Brown 2. A year later, a second Supreme Court act was passed. It was Brown 2. It said that school systems had to integrate. The Florida plan was, you're going to have violence, you're going to have problems if you rush it. So Brown 2's platform was, schools have to integrate with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now, what that meant was left up to the state. And that was the Florida ideal. Because what Florida passes in 1956 is another way that school integration was slowed to a halt. What Florida basically determined, and it becomes a blueprint for other southern states, is that we are going to send school integration to the counties. 67 counties in Florida. We're going to have 67 different school integration plans. It put the impetus on desegregation on black parents. Because the argument was, not in every county, black people don't want to go to school with white people. The Pupil Assignment Law of 1956 is what gave county school boards the power to develop their own school desegregation laws. And it said, and I just read this because the wording, this is the legislation. The idea that Florida would use legislation to stop movements to equalize the schools, I'm glad those days are over. The school board said, well, the legislature said school boards had to consider, quote, the sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors that will prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils in determining pupil assignment. Furthermore, the boards had to consider, quote, the scholastic aptitude, intelligence, and mental energy and or ability of every student seeking reassignment. Yeah. So, if you look at different counties, the policies that are put into place to make this as difficult as possible for parents to even apply for their children to attend integrated schools is almost Herculean. What happens is that, to keep the federal government out of these counties, what the state would encourage was for, on a token level, students to be admitted. Not all, but 90% of applicants don't meet this threshold. So the first school that integrates, Miami's Orchard Villa Elementary School, allowed 4 African Americans in 1961. 4. Within a year and a half, the school was 90% black. 4 students. 90% black a year and a half later. The governor, who has the reputation as a racial moderate, is pictured on that Time magazine cover, Leroy Collins. Now, Leroy Collins is a moderate when compared to other Southern governors, but then again, George Wallace is moderate Genghis Khan is moderate compared to George Wallace, right? What Leroy Collins does, now, publicly he's saying things like, quote, the NAACP is forcing the issue of racial equality on unwilling white citizens, forcing it. He said that Brown was, quote, a cruel hoax on the American people, and that, quote, Florida is just as determined as any other southern state to maintain segregation. But, he is also the first southern governor to claim that he is the governor for every citizen regardless of race. That's often the thing about Leroy Collins. He was called Floridian of the Century by many news outlets, right? Because he demonstrated courage in a time of crisis. The thing that's often left out is the context, and that's one of the things that historians bring to these discussions is context. The context is, that was in the March of his last year that he could serve as governor. So when he was a lame duck governor who had already advocated for segregation, signed off on the pupil assignment law, then he says, I'm everybody's governor. And he looks moderate by comparison. When the reality is, if we look at Florida, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. In 1968, the Republican candidate is Richard Nixon. The independent candidate is George Wallace. In the 1968 presidential election combined, George Wallace and Richard Nixon obtained 70.5% of the popular vote in Florida. 70.5% of the popular vote. This is the bell being rung of when the white South begins to leave the Democratic Party and enter the Republican Party. Okay? Because the Democratic Party of today and the Republican Party of today are not the same as they were 40, 50, 60 years ago. When does that begin to change? In the 1960s. Why does it begin to change? Because the Democratic Party was the party of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he told his speechwriter, Bill Moyers, I just lost the white South for a generation. He was wrong. It's longer. So, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. Politically, Florida is the bellwether for the rest of the nation. One of my contentions is that when it comes to the rest of the nation responded to integration demands by doing it as slowly as possible to delay. But look, I don't want to leave you with a pessimistic view of the movement in Florida, right? Yes, it's pessimistic, it's dark, but all you have to do is look locally for people who in some cases risked their lives to guarantee constitutional rights for all who lived at that time. Harry T. Moore, 1951, assassinated for the crime of registering African Americans to vote, for filing a lawsuit to equalize teacher salaries for black and white teachers in the state, for investigating acts of racial injustice and murder attempts that people like Willis McCall were trying to call out. Harry T. Moore, often not in the textbooks. H.K. Matthews, to the top right, kept in Pensacola the dream of an SCLC beloved community alive. He was the one that said in Escambia County, no, police brutality is a civil rights issue. No, Confederate imagery in the public school system in Escambia County is a civil rights issue. And he was railroaded legally, the story of which is told in the award-winning Beyond Integration. C.K. Steele, the person who was the vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization. He started the Tallahassee bus boycott that began before the Montgomery bus boycott had even ended. A minister. Not all of these people were ministers. Not all adhere to nonviolence. Some advocate for self-defense, like Harry T. Moore, right? So we can look locally at people who, without the help of national organizations, sometimes even to the detriment of national organizations, did what they could to make their communities a better place for the next generation. And so on it goes. Mary McLeod Bethune in The Power of Education. Dr. Robert Hayling, the dentist in St. Augustine, the reason for SCLC being invited to St. Augustine in 1963. Student activists at Florida A&M. It's not just our young people, it's also our colleges, just like North Carolina A&T, just like Fisk University, just like Tougaloo in Mississippi. We also have a Tallahassee campaign that's sparked by Florida A&M students. But most importantly, look, every community has to go through a policy of integration, and there are local people who lead that. What Florida demonstrates is that the movement for racial justice is not top-down. It's bottom-up. As Ella Baker said, Florida demonstrates that strong people don't need strong leaders. But most importantly, the relevance. The relevance. We can't understand events today unless we give it the historical context to understand why it is a pattern of second-class citizenship and a mindset that continues to divide this nation. We can't understand the relevance of what has happened in our state with people who are appointed to public office who have no problem having pictures of them posing in Klan outfits made public. Why is that a problem? There was a backlash. Why should he have to resign? He was young. No, there's a history here, and there should be accountability for public servants. The legacy of mobilized racial violence, the Proud Boys aren't born in a bubble. There's a legacy of organized racial violence, racially motivated violence, white supremacy that exists in this state. The presence of symbols at political rallies have a history that is meant to remind people that they are seen as less than equal citizens. And maybe even campaigns to keep this history silent. That's where I get bothered, okay? I get personally offended from a professional standpoint when, particularly as somebody who looks like me and has this accent, is told that what you are teaching is too woke, or that it's divisive, or that it's uncomfortable. And that's happened. This is not a manufactured crisis. This isn't a boogeyman. This happened to me in 2022, before it became a national movement. Okay? I was scheduled to talk to a group of teachers, not quite as big as this room, but a group of teachers about the civil rights movement. And a school district in Florida, whose county I will not repeat, Osceola, claimed that the topic itself, the civil rights movement, was evidence that critical race theory had infected our education. So I spoke out. The history I study, I would think it would be a professional malpractice for me to stay silent when the right to tell the stories of people who sacrificed a hell of a lot more than I have has been told is too divisive. No, this is the quintessential American story, right? We hear a little bit about patriotic education. My friends, let me tell you something. The most patriotic education that you can give your children is one that puts an emphasis on the Constitution and citizenship rights at the very center. And the civil rights movement demonstrates that more than any other topic that we can teach. Okay? Oh, thank you. I didn't mean for that, but yeah, it is. Look, the civil rights movement is the quintessential American success story. It is how can you use the system when you have no hope of the system protecting you to reform the system, when there's no evidence that the system gives a damn about you as a human being. That's the story of the civil rights movement. And to try to deprive our students, most importantly our teachers, of these valuable lessons as American citizens because of political purposes. I don't care what your politics are, left, right, or center. History doesn't care about how it makes you feel. In fact, with a lot of the topics that I've exposed to you to today, I hope it makes you feel uncomfortable. Because it makes you feel uncomfortable to know that it happened literally in your backyards. Right? You can't have growth without temporary discomfort. Go to the gym. You're going to be sore, or you're doing it wrong. That's why I don't go to the gym. I study this history. It's painful enough. Right? So, don't fall for bad faith actors telling you how the past should be used. Okay? The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. Don't let people tell you what these concepts mean, which are meant to encourage people to avoid topics that are, quote unquote, potentially uncomfortable. It's the story of who we are as America. America as a whole, warts and all. So, the importance. Again, I do this with my students. At the end of every lecture, there's an important slide. Okay, what do I want you to take away from it? Because college students are like that, you know. Let's reiterate. Number one, Florida should be at the center of how we understand the civil rights movement and the struggle for racial justice in America, not at the periphery. Florida should be at the center. We can understand the role that social class and economics, race, gender, and political delay play in complicating the legacy that the Constitution has guaranteed to all of us. But I think most importantly, and this is something that I want to leave you with, desegregation is not integration. We can talk about a movement to desegregate, but that doesn't mean we have fully integrated. Okay? The civil rights movement is not just a movement to desegregate. That's the first step. The civil rights movement is a fight to integrate this country, to make all people of all races and all backgrounds feel equal to us as American citizens, as the Constitution guarantees. Are we there yet? No. Will we ever get there? I don't know. But to fulfill those rights, one of the things that we have to do is be honest with ourselves about our past. And as long as we label it politically motivated or derogatory or divisive, we will never fulfill our promise equally to all citizens. Thank you very much.